Is everything all right? Alex turned to me, his dark eyes sparkling with concern. Yes, of course. I smiled, trying to shake off that strange feeling, but even as I spoke the words, I realized I had lied. Nothing was all right. The door to the house opened before we even reached it. My mother always greeted us at the door with that same warm smile, as if everything in her world was in its proper place, and tonight was no exception. Hello, dears. Come on in, everything's almost ready. She quickly kissed me on the cheek and smiled at Alex. We stepped into the house, filled with familiar scents of home-cooked meals and the warmth of the old hearth. Daniel appeared in the room. My stepfather was his usual relaxed self, dressed in the suit he wore to work, with his shirt collar slightly undone. Hi, Lily. His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes that I couldn't immediately grasp. Hi, Daniel. I nodded briefly and looked away. Once, long ago, before he married my mother, there had been a spark between us. I had always thought it was a fluke, a youthful mistake, a fleeting infatuation that had long since faded into the past. We decided not to pursue anything and to never speak of it. We ignored it. How are you? His question was so neutral that it shouldn't have stirred anything in me, but his voice carried a hint of something more. I'm fine, I replied, trying to sound confident, but my heart began to race. I busied myself helping my mother set the table, trying to escape the moment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Alex was chatting with my brother in the other room, laughing and joking, completely unaware that a storm was brewing inside me. He had always been like that. Kind, loving, and terribly attentive when it came to caring for me. But now, he didn't notice that my thoughts were far away. The evening moved forward smoothly. The clatter of plates, the sound of forks tapping the table, and the usual conversations around us created an illusion of calm. We all sat around the large table, and I tried to focus on something my mother was enthusiastically talking about. Alex, as always, was fully engaged in the conversation, nodding at the right moments and tossing in witty remarks. But my attention kept drifting toward Daniel. He sat across from me, quietly cutting his food, yet his gaze would slide toward me again and again. It was barely noticeable, but I could feel it. Each time our eyes met, I felt my body tense, as if his presence stirred something in me. Something unclear yet powerful. I knew it was wrong, knew I should turn away and ignore him. But something inside me rebelled against that thought. Lily, are you all right? My mother's voice pulled me out of the loop of my own thoughts. Suddenly, everyone's attention turned to me, and I felt heat rush to my face. Yes, I was just lost in thought. I forced a smile, but my mother's gaze was far too sharp. You've been daydreaming a lot lately, Alex chuckled, placing his hand on my shoulder. His touch should have comforted me, grounded me in the moment, but it only heightened the tension. We all have days like that, Daniel interjected, his voice unexpectedly soft and a little too personal for an ordinary dinner. I wasn't sure if anyone else noticed it, but to me his words felt like a private joke, as if we were sharing a secret that only the two of us knew. My hands trembled involuntarily, and in that moment, I felt like he was playing a game with me, testing how far I was willing to go. Alex, you mentioned you had a new project at work. Daniel suddenly changed the subject, clearly sensing that the tension between us was becoming noticeable. I was grateful for the shift, but inside everything was still churning. Alex, pleased that the conversation had returned to more familiar topics, began talking about his projects, but I could no longer focus on him. A single question kept circling in my mind. What if I couldn't resist this strange yet powerful pull between Daniel and me? What if the old feelings I had so carefully buried were rising to the surface again? After dinner, when everyone had relaxed a bit, I found myself glancing at the door, ready to leave earlier than expected. Alex was still chatting with my brother, and I took the opportunity to step out into the quiet garden behind the house. I thought I could calm down alone, but as soon as I stepped outside, I heard footsteps behind me. Lily. That voice again. I froze, unable to turn around. Daniel stepped closer, his voice low and quiet, like a whisper that made the ground tremble beneath me. "Is everything really all right?" he asked again, this time clearly implying something more. I stood in the garden, feeling trapped. My hands clenched into fists, and a cold sweat ran down my spine. Daniel stood too close, his presence filling all the space around me. The air suddenly felt heavy, as if there wasn't enough of it to breathe. "Is everything really all right?" His voice sounded almost caring, but I sensed the hidden power in those words. He was asking the question I had been asking myself for weeks. And the answer, the one I was too afraid to voice, burned in my mind like a red flame. "Yes." I nodded quickly, but my voice trembled. I took a step forward, intending to walk back into the house, but Daniel gently grasped my wrist, stopping me. The gesture was subtle, but a shiver ran through me. I turned and met his gaze. "Lily," he began, but I sharply pulled my hand away and stepped back, breaking the tense closeness. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought it might burst from my chest. "Don't—" I tried to sound firm, but the words were fragile, as if they might shatter at any moment. In that instant, I realized that our old feelings had never truly disappeared. They had only lain dormant, waiting for the right moment. And now they had returned, stronger and more dangerous than before. "We can't." I forced the words out, struggling to hold back tears. I couldn't allow myself this. I couldn't betray Alex, my mother, or the life I had worked so hard to build. But Daniel didn't back down. He stepped closer again, so close that I could feel his breath on my skin. "Are you sure about that?" His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. I knew that he understood the depth of my feelings, because they were reflected in him too. We were both caught in a trap of our own making. "I'm married," I finally said, as if that could bring me back to reality. Those words were my last shield, the one I used to protect myself and my family. "And I'm married," he replied simply, but there was no judgment or reproach in his voice, only the stark truth. We both knew we were walking along the edge of a cliff. I took a deep breath and looked around the garden. This place, which had once been my oasis of peace, was now the arena for my internal conflict. Everything inside me screamed that I needed to leave, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. "We can't," I repeated, this time with a bit more conviction. Daniel finally let go of my hand and stepped back, giving me space. He nodded silently, but in his eyes I saw that this story wasn't over. We both understood that this evening was just the beginning of something bigger. After that tense moment in the garden, I returned to the house, trying to immerse myself in the bustle of the family dinner as quickly as possible, as if the ordinary conversations and the comfort of home could chase away the turmoil swirling inside me. Alex was sitting at the table with my brother, deeply engrossed in discussing something, and thankfully he didn't notice my quiet return. I stood by the kitchen counter, trying to focus on the food and my mother's story about some incident with the neighbors. Time seemed to drag, and every word felt hollow. I fought with myself, struggling to maintain a semblance of normality, but the internal tension was growing. Each time Daniel passed by, his hand or shoulder brushed against me, and those accidental touches ignited a fire in my chest that I desperately tried to smother. After dinner, as the guests started to leave, I realized I was still lingering in the house, even though we usually left early on nights like this. I didn't want to stay, but something inside me kept me rooted in place, as if I was waiting for something I couldn't explain. Alex was standing by the door, joking with my brother, waiting for me. I went into the living room to grab my forgotten phone, intending to return to them, when suddenly Daniel appeared beside me. We found ourselves alone in the room. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. "Lily," he began softly. I froze. The moment was unbearably tense. I knew that if I didn't leave right now, something would happen that I wouldn't be able to undo. "Please," I whispered, not turning to face him. "We have to stop." But he was already so close that I could feel his breath on my skin again. We were just a few steps away from the door, where Alex and my brother were still casually chatting. It was like a scene from a movie, where everything slows down, and the only thing that matters is the moment suspended between us. After that night, everything changed. We crossed a line we had promised ourselves we wouldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, the memory of that moment in the living room came rushing back, when I didn't leave, didn't stop him, but instead allowed myself to give in to the desire. I still loved Alex, but with each passing day, I felt more and more trapped in my own life, as if I were drowning in a sea of lies from which I couldn't escape. Daniel and I began finding ways to see each other. It started with brief encounters that seemed innocent. At first, it was just glances across the table, accidental touches during family gatherings. Then we began texting each other. Short messages, but laden with meaning, like secret signals in the midst of everyday life. "How are you?" he would write. "Thinking of you," I'd respond, my heart skipping a beat as I typed the words. These small exchanges only strengthened the connection between us. Soon the messages weren't enough. We started finding excuses to meet in secret. When my mother went into town for errands, Daniel would find a reason to invite me to his house. One day, when Alex was at work and Daniel texted me that his wife had gone away for a few days, I drove over to his house. When I entered, he was standing in the doorway and our eyes met. There was so much unspoken between us, so much that felt inevitable. I could no longer pretend that this was just harmless flirting or a fleeting attraction. It was something more. "I can't be without you, Lily," he said softly, closing the door behind me. I stepped closer, feeling a burning inside from his words. We stood silently, facing each other, and everything I had told myself before, about morality, duty, family, vanished like smoke. In that moment, it was just him and me, and it felt like the most right thing in the world. We started meeting in secret. Every encounter brought an exhilarating sense of freedom and, at the same time, a growing sense of guilt that intensified with each passing day. I knew I was playing with fire, knew that sooner or later Alex would notice something was off. But each time I came home, I skillfully masked my feelings, feigning exhaustion, work troubles, anything to distract him. Yet inside me, the anxiety was building. With every day, with every meeting with Daniel, I realized that this couldn't last forever. Sooner or later, everything would come to light, and when it did, I knew I would lose everything. With each passing day, the weight of my lies grew heavier. I tried to act as if everything was normal, but Alex began to notice the changes. "You've been acting different lately," he said one evening while we sat on the couch watching TV. His voice was filled with concern, but there was no accusation in it. He was a loving, caring husband, and that made the pain even worse. I turned away, trying to hide the guilt that crawled over my body. How could I betray him? How had I let myself end up in this situation? "I'm just tired." I forced a strained smile. "Work has been overwhelming, and there's a lot going on with Mom, too." As always, he believed me. I saw his shoulders relax, saw how he accepted my explanation as the truth once again. But something inside me cracked. I knew the day was coming. The day when my excuses would no longer work. The nights had become especially torturous. I would lie next to Alex, who slept peacefully, while my mind churned with guilt and fear. Dreams of being confronted with the truth came more frequently. I saw Alex looking at me with disappointment and pain, walking away, leaving me alone and shattered. But the worst part wasn't the fear of losing him. It was the realization that I couldn't stop. My meetings with Daniel continued. We became more careful, choosing moments when no one would suspect us. One evening, as we were having dinner together, Alex suddenly paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, and looked at me with real worry. "Lily." His voice was gentle but serious. "What's going on?" My heart froze. This was the moment I had feared most. I put my fork down and tried to act like everything was fine, but his eyes didn't move away from mine. "I don't know what you mean," I mumbled, trying to sound innocent. But inside, everything tightened. "You're not here," he continued. "It's like you've checked out. I can feel it." He took my hand, and his touch was so familiar, yet at the same time it felt so distant. I could feel our relationship crumbling, and it was because of me. It's just the stress. I lied again, but this time my voice wavered. Alex went quiet, his eyes searching my face as if he was trying to find something he couldn't quite understand. "All right," he finally said, but there was something in his tone that I hadn't heard before. Doubt. Fear. We both knew that the time for explanations was running out, that I couldn't hide the truth much longer. After dinner, I retreated to the bedroom under the pretense of exhaustion, but in reality, I needed time to collect my thoughts. I sat on the bed, trembling with fear, staring at my phone. A message from Daniel had come in earlier. "Miss you," it said. I stared at that word, and tears welled up in my eyes. Alex was just in the next room, completely unaware that I was living a double life, that my heart was torn between two men. But I knew this couldn't go on much longer. The facade was crumbling, and soon everything would come crashing down. We met at Daniel's house. I arrived, but this time, something felt different. When I walked in, I felt a coldness that I had never experienced before. He sat in the chair, staring out the window, lost in his own thoughts. "Is something wrong?" I asked, sensing the rising tension inside me. He remained silent for several long seconds. Then, without looking at me, he said, "We've gone too far, Lily." I froze. His words, which might have once sounded like a call for caution, now felt like a final verdict. Something inside me tightened, and a lump formed in my throat. "What do you mean?" I tried to stay calm, but my voice trembled. He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with regret and pain. This was the Daniel I had known for years, but now there was a chasm between us. "We're risking everything. I think we need to end this before we destroy it all." I stared at him in disbelief. This man, who had been the embodiment of passion and my escape from reality, was now suggesting we end it. But something in his words rang true, even though I didn't want to admit it. We both knew we had been playing with fire for far too long. "Is that what you want?" I asked quietly, feeling everything inside me crumble. I hoped he would say no, that he would find a reason for us to continue. But he was serious. "I don't want to destroy your family. Or mine," he said, looking away as if he feared seeing my reaction. My heart pounded in my ears, and everything inside me screamed against his words. I couldn't accept this so easily. I had invested too much into this relationship, despite all the pain and guilt. I couldn't just let him go. "But what about what we feel?" I asked, and there was a plea in my voice. He sighed, looking at me again. "It's wrong, Lily. We both know it. We just don't want to admit it." Those words hit me like a cold wave. I knew he was right, but part of me refused to believe that everything we had between us was a mistake. I felt how our emotions had overtaken us, how we had both lost control of something we should have kept in check from the beginning. We sat in silence for several minutes, each one dragging out like an eternity. I wanted to scream that I couldn't lose him, that I couldn't go back to the emptiness I felt before our meetings. But the voice of reason finally broke through the walls of my emotions. "You're right," I said, barely getting the words out, feeling as if they were cutting my tongue. "We need to stop." He nodded, and in that moment, I saw a weight lift from his shoulders. It was a decision he had already made for himself, and maybe, deep down, I knew he was right. But the sense of loss was too overwhelming to simply let go. I stood up, knowing there was no point in staying any longer. Our relationship had reached a dead end, and beyond that was only a precipice. I had to choose: preserve what I had or dive into chaos and destroy everything. "We're done," I said quietly, heading for the door, feeling my world collapse around me. Daniel didn't follow. He just watched silently as I left. When I returned home, Alex was sitting on the couch reading the news on his phone. He looked up at me and smiled as if nothing had happened. I stood in the doorway, feeling a fresh wave of guilt wash over me. I had betrayed him, yet he continued to love me, unaware that the shadow of another man stood between us. One of those nights when Alex came home late from work, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, trying to gather my thoughts. He walked into the room, tired but still with a smile on his face, as if he was ready to tell me yet another story from work. But when he saw the expression on my face, his smile vanished. "Are you okay?" His voice was gentle, but I could hear the worry in it. He had been watching me retreat into myself for too long, and now his patience was starting to wear thin. I knew I couldn't keep hiding the truth anymore. The weight of the lie I had been carrying had become unbearable. This was the moment I had dreaded most, the moment when everything would come to light. I took a deep breath, feeling the lump in my throat grow, but I knew I had to speak. "We need to talk," I began quietly, and he immediately knew this wasn't just a regular conversation. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tight, as if he already sensed what I was about to say. "Alex, I hesitated for a second, but then realized there was no easy way to say it. So I just said it. "I've been seeing someone else." "Who?" His voice was so quiet that I could barely hear it, but in that silence was more pain than any scream could convey. I gathered the last bit of strength I had and answered. "Daniel." "You, with my stepfather?" His voice was low, but I could hear everything in it. Shock, disappointment, anger, and pain. I nodded, unable to look him in the eyes. He stepped back, as if trying to process what was happening, as if he couldn't believe this was real. "How could you?" His voice trembled now. "How could you betray me like that?" Alex moved closer, his face twisted with hurt. "I trusted you. I thought we—" He couldn't finish, falling silent as if words failed him. "I'm leaving," he finally said, in a voice I had never heard before. It was the voice of someone whose heart had been shattered, and I knew there was no way I could ever fix it. He turned and left, slamming the door behind him, leaving me alone in absolute silence. When the door closed behind Alex, the silence became deafening. I sat at the kitchen table, feeling my world crumble around me. He was gone, and I knew it wasn't temporary. The moment I told him the truth, my life as I knew it had ended. I sat there, motionless, trying to comprehend what had just happened. I had lost Alex, my husband, the man who had stood by me all these years, who loved me no matter what. And it was all because I couldn't control my feelings for Daniel. The pain and disappointment I saw in Alex's eyes were a direct reflection of what I had caused. But it wasn't over. The next morning, I woke up in an empty house. Alex hadn't returned. I knew deep down that he was likely gone for good. There was no note, no call, no message. He had simply vanished from my life. But the scariest part was knowing that I now had to face another inevitable moment: telling my mother. I couldn't just hide the truth, not when it was going to affect not only me and Alex, but also her and Daniel. I understood that once the truth came out, I wouldn't just lose my husband. I'd lose my family too. With trembling fingers, I dialed my mother's number. My heart pounded so hard it echoed in my head. It felt like I was on the edge of a cliff, ready to fall. "Lily, what's wrong? You don't sound like yourself." Her voice was filled with the usual warmth and care, and it made my heart ache. "Mom, I need to tell you something," I began, feeling the words catch in my throat. I told her everything. How my relationship with Daniel started, how we had been hiding it, and how I had finally confessed it all to Alex. With every word, the silence on the other end of the phone grew heavier. By the time I finished, there was nothing but a crushing, painful quiet. "Lily," she finally said, but her voice sounded like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "How could you? How could you do this to us?" I heard the same despair in her voice that I had heard in Alex's the night before. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse me, but the pain in her tone was unbearable. My mother, the woman who had always been my source of strength and support, was now broken. "You've destroyed everything we had," she said quietly. "You've torn apart our family." How am I supposed to live with this now? I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was sinking into an abyss of guilt. Her words pierced through me like knives, each one deeper than the last. You knew how much Daniel meant to me, she continued, her voice growing weaker with each word. You knew how much I trusted him. And you. And now what? How am I supposed to forgive you for this? Those words shattered me. I felt my world collapsing, the ties I thought were unbreakable unraveling completely. My mother hung up, and I was left alone, swallowed by the silence and emptiness. She didn't scream. She didn't curse. What she did was worse. She simply left, just like Alex. I had lost everything. My husband, my family, the trust of those I loved. Now I stood at the edge of a precipice, and no one was there to pull me back. Several months had passed since the day I confessed my mistakes, and my life fell apart. Alex didn't come back. He collected his things a few days after he left, and I didn't even see him when it happened. It was a silent final break. All the years we spent together, the memories, everything that once tied us vanished, as if it had never existed. My mother also distanced herself. She couldn't forgive me for ruining her marriage and our family. Daniel disappeared from our lives as if he had never been there. He left town shortly after the truth came out. Maybe he was trying to escape the destruction he left behind, but none of us tried to bring him back. We were all shattered, and every part of my life seemed destroyed. For months, I lived on autopilot. Every day was like the one before, empty and indifferent. Work, home, loneliness. I didn't know how to move forward, how to start living again after what I had done. But one morning, when I woke up in my small apartment, no Alex, no trace of his belongings, I realized I couldn't keep living in the past. I decided to move to another city, a place where no one knew me, where no one knew my story or judged me for my mistakes. I sold our house and bought a small apartment in a different city, far from all the memories. It was a step toward a new beginning, a new life. The first few days in the new place were strange. I often woke up at night expecting to see Alex beside me or to hear my mother's voice on the answering machine, but instead, I was met with silence. It was hard. But over time, I began to adapt to this new rhythm. Each day, I tried to relearn how to live. Small steps, rebuilding myself. My identity that I had lost in the whirlwind of mistakes and betrayal. I found a job at a local library. It was a place where I could hide behind books, behind the stories of others. And slowly, through the work, I began to rediscover myself. In the silence between the bookshelves, in the tranquility of the small town, I realized that life goes on, even after such devastation. Time passed, and the pain began to ease. I no longer lived with the constant thought that I had ruined my life. Instead, I started to see that I had a chance to build a new one. It was a different life, without Alex, without my mother by my side. But it was still mine. I accepted my mistakes. I couldn't change the past, but I could learn to live with its consequences. One warm autumn evening, as I sat on a bench in the park with a book, I felt something new, a light sense of peace. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I realized that despite everything I had lost, I had the opportunity to start over. I no longer expected forgiveness from anyone. My mother might never forgive me. Alex was gone from my life forever, but I didn't need their forgiveness to move forward anymore. I had forgiven myself. I accepted my guilt, my mistakes, and now I could look ahead. My new life was far from perfect, but it was mine. And in this new beginning, I found something I had lost a long time ago, myself. Several years have passed since my life completely changed. I went through hell and back, but in the end, I found my way to myself and to a new beginning, one I hadn't expected but turned out to be exactly what I needed. My new life was simple, free from the intensity and drama that had once consumed me. I was still working at the library, where I found incredible peace in the silence and the books. But something in my life had begun to change, though I didn't realize it at first. On weekends, I often took long walks around the city or went beyond its borders, finding solace in nature. Nature had become a symbol of rebirth, renewal, and the endless cycle of life for me. One day, during one of those trips, I met a man named Mark. He was a straightforward, open person, the complete opposite of Daniel. No secrets, no pressure, no complex emotional games. He was simply himself. And it turned out to be exactly what I didn't know I needed. We met by chance in a cafe, where I sat with a book and a cup of coffee. He sat at the table next to mine and with a smile asked what I was reading. It was such a simple question, one that once might have seemed banal, but at that moment, it felt like an invitation to something new. Our conversations were light, with no hint of tension. I expected nothing from him, and he didn't try to demand more from me than I could give. He understood that I carried the weight of my past with me, although I didn't tell him everything right away. But with Mark, there was no need to rush. He didn't pry into my past or insist that I open up fully. And perhaps that was the most valuable thing. He gave me space to be myself, without the fear of being judged. We began to spend more time together. At first, it was just friendly meetings, but gradually, something more began to grow between us. It was a slow but steady closeness. I didn't build any illusions or expect Mark to be the solution to all my problems. But with him, I started to feel alive again, capable of love. But this time, a different kind of love, one free from desperation and hidden passions. One evening, as we sat by the shore of a lake in the suburbs where we had spent the day, he turned to me and asked, "Are you happy?" I froze, unsure of how to answer. But looking back at everything I had been through, I realized that despite the pain, losses, and mistakes, I had indeed found happiness. Maybe not in the way I had imagined before, but happiness had found me. "Yes," I replied, smiling. And in that moment, I truly believed it.